So before having to break up any more unfriendly conversation between the Marine Corps and the Air Force, I think we'll start the event. Good afternoon. Welcome. I'm Fred Kemp, President and CEO of the Atlantic Council. And I always say it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the rollout. It's really my great pleasure to welcome you to the rollout of this important and groundbreaking report. This is the kind of work we love to do at the Atlantic Council, which is taking a look at an issue that everyone says, well, you can't change that. It's just too big to change. It's too difficult to change. There are too many assets involved. It's just impossible. On the other hand, everybody looks at it and says, yeah, we agree, it doesn't work. And so we took that on, and we wanted, and what you have in front of you, there have already been some news reports on it, embargo was today, until today, is the culmination of a year-long effort in figuring out how the United States can position itself best in the world, leveraging its military commands, but beyond that, using all the elements of national influence and power to achieve its objectives with its friends and with its allies. The task force, which has been chaired so ably by General James L. Jones, General Jones, chair of our Brent Scowcroft Center for International Security, former National Security Advisor, former Marine Commandant, former Supreme Allied Commander Europe. And the task force included combatant commanders, former combatant commanders, ambassadors, assistant secretaries, business leaders, other former high-level officials, and it met multiple times to discuss a central question. Are the US Combatant Commands, as they're set up today, sufficient as a sole forward element of the US government that takes a regional perspective to help the United States achieve its foreign and defense policy objectives? The answer, as you will find in the report, is no. As the United States contends with global instability unseen since decades ago, and some say unprecedented, how the U.S. engages in the world becomes increasingly important. But when you look into the mechanics of how the U.S. exercises that leadership, as the task force did, it's evident that a retooling of hierarchy, procedures, jurisdiction, and outlook is required. In fact, I think, as you'll hear, even the name Combatant Command is problematic. The task force then proposed solutions to these challenges in the report that General Jones will now brief you on. It's an important read who want the U.S. to maintain its influence in the 21st century and to wield that influence intelligently and effectively alongside friends and allies. All you have to do is look around the world a little bit to say quite simply, we can and must do better. Before we begin, let me just say a few thank yous. First, of course, to General Jones himself, the chairman of the task force, and to the task force members for giving up their time and offering their talents to this effort. Special thanks to George Moose, who will be one of the panelists introduced by Barry Pavel. I want to thank Barry for leading the Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security so effectively. I clearly want to thank Alex Ward for the work that he's done on this with others in this. A special thank you for someone's not here, Colonel Kim Campbell. She was our Air Force Fellow at the Scowcroft Center last year, and she was really the leader behind the scenes and was the rapporteur for this report. Her efforts are exemplary and exactly what we expect from the talented military fellows who come to the council. I believe she's now Colonel Select at the Pentagon. Is that right, Barry? And so wherever you are out there, Kim, we miss you here at the Atlantic Council. Come on back whenever you can. It's always a great pleasure and very unique when General Jones chairs one of our task force. He did so importantly before he became National Security Advisor in Afghanistan. That ended up making a big difference in global thinking toward the issues there. And I hope that this will shift thinking as well. So with that, I want to pass to General Jones, who will brief you on the main findings. Even though his remarks cannot be comprehensive, the report will do that. And so I urge you to read it. As usual, they'll be enlightening and to the point. And General Jones, thank you for everything you've done with this report and everything you do for the Atlantic Council in general.
So Fred, thank you very, very much. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here. I always wondered where people in Washington went in the afternoons where they didn't have anything else to do, and now I know. So it's great to see you all. Thank you. And a special welcome to Chuck Wald. General Wald was really the real commander of the United States European Command when I was there, and did a great job and was one of the visionary leaders who proposed that the existence of AFRICOM should take place, and I want to make sure that I recognize Chuck for his tremendous contribution at a critical time, not only in the European Command, but also in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization's existence. I also want to just recognize the work of the Scowcroft Center, which was created here at the Atlantic Council to tackle the difficult, tough strategic issues like the ones we're about to discuss today. Recognize and thank Barry Pavel for his leadership, and also Kim Campbell, who Fred recognized a minute ago, Colonel Select, United States Air Force, and the military fellows that served here in the Atlantic Council for a year. I think they got a tremendous education. And are each of them going back to their services, have gone back to their services to pursue what I'm sure will be very important careers, and they'll make tremendous contribution to our national security, largely because of the experience they had here at the Atlantic Council. Kim Campbell is now the military assistant to the Undersecretary of Defense for policy, and so you can see that the Defense Department clearly valued her assignment here and put her in a position where she can really make a big contribution in the Pentagon. I'd also like to thank the members of the task force for their time. You will see by looking at their names that they come from all walks of life, and they donated their time generously. We thought we would do this in a couple of meetings, and it turned out to be 3, then 4, then 5, then 6, and the discussions were rich and far-reaching, and I think we've produced a document that everybody is comfortable with. I'd like to thank Ambassador Moose for being here today, and I look forward to our discussions after this brief introduction. So why did we do this? And I think the reason we did this is because collectively we are of the opinion that national engagement, U.S. national engagement in the 21st century has to be one that evolves from its 20th century birthplace. The world in the 20th century was very bipolar in the sense of how things were divided up. We created institutions and organizations, both military and civilian, that were organized and staffed and funded to take care of the problems as they arose. And hindsight's always perfect, but it seems to me that that the issues that came up in the 20th century, while very serious, it had a certain measure of pace to them. And organizations that were created, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the UN, our own systems here in Washington were pretty well equipped to deal with the pace at which global events of significantly great importance would face us. With the dissolution of the Soviet Empire, and now some say witnessing the rebirth of the Soviet Empire, we're in a different time. We're in a different time where technology and social media has accelerated the pace of events. They come at us in waves. They're asymmetric. They're nonlinear, and they must be dealt with both understanding and speed in order to be effective. And so we thought it would be useful for a group to form to take a look at really one of the great gifts of the 20th century, the establishment of what we call combatant commands, but have been called other things like unified commands, geographical commands, and have done a wonderful job. But it's a gift of the 20th century because those commands were essentially born in the Cold War. And they were born to respond to the challenges faced by the bipolar world of the West and the East and the dividing lines between them. That world has disappeared for the most part. We know we're living in a multipolar world. We know that the challenges to our national security are far more diverse than just nuclear throw weight and submarines and bombers and military might alone. And those of us who pay attention to these issues have come to the conclusion that it just might be that our national response to the engagement strategies and challenges that we face has to also evolve. And so too will some of the institutions that we have hitherto relied on to make sure that they are capable of adding to the achievement of our national goals and objectives. And some of those institutions include the very structure and functioning of what we now call the US Combatant Commands. And we'll talk about that term a little bit because it does impact on their how people perceive their missions. But it also is reflective of a common vision in our group that the world today is so difficult and things are happening at such a rapid pace that the ability to react quickly and correctly to challenges, be they military, be they economic, or whatever, are better done if you can take an informed regional approach to the world events. And here is one of the great dichotomies of our national response structure. For many, many years, these combatant commands have been at the forefront of what I would offer are regional military strategies, regionally focused with militaries, exercises, peacemaking, peacekeeping operations, able to respond to flashpoints, but again, in mostly a purely military concept. In today's world, where the challenges are coming at us not only in waves, but in asymmetric waves, with non-state actors playing large roles, with economic challenges facing us, with cybersecurity, even energy security and economic security also being at the forefront of what concerns us most. We talked a little bit about how these great gifts of the 20th century might be able to be transposed and transformed into a capability representing more utility in the 21st century to respond to the network of challenges and also to respond to better understand the world that we live in on a regional basis. And there's a lot of talk periodically about cutting back on our forward-based military commands due to budgetary pressures, or some people thinking that they're anachronisms of a bygone era. I take a completely different view on that, and I think most of our panel members do as well, in the sense that one of my favorite sayings in the Defense Department was virtual presence is actual absence. And by that I mean that if you're not there, you're not there. And you can try to make up for it any way you want, but this gift that I keep talking about of the 20th century gives the United States of America a tremendous footprint in different geographical regions. And please understand that here we are talking about geographical commands more than functional commands, functional unified commands. But that presence is extremely important. And if you are to pull back on those, on not only the presence, but the capabilities that they imply, then you set up a world in which you have vacuums. And vacuums are generally always replaced and filled by things that you don't particularly like. I mean, that's just the nature of it. So when you look at the 21st century and you think about how competitive it is in an economic sense, and that really is the dramatic difference. I don't think anybody's seriously thinking about World War III in a 20th century context, but I think you could make a case that World War III is already here in the sense of economic challenges to our supremacy and our position in terms of being an influential nation on the planet. And so the question is, how do we adjust to that? And again, I come back to the fact that the reason for this work is to not offer the only 2 or 3 solutions we could come up with, but just to put 2 or 3 out there for discussions, and hopefully that somewhere in our government that somebody will take a look at that. We ought to look at that in depth. There is something to say that what if we, in addition to having a militarily based forward presence, we also had a senior State Department official who had regional responsibility and could coordinate the activities of embassies at a regional basis. Because, frankly, in the State Department, the regional authorities are right here in Foggy Bottom, where the strategic authorities are as well. They're co-located, always have been, not a criticism, but that's just the way it's been. But what about, in addition to the military capability, having a political presence and an economic presence from the Department of Commerce, or an energy presence from the Department of Energy, to say nothing of our intelligence communities, so that we can better interface, better understand, and better react to the pace in which world events are unfolding. It also this work is also representative of a fundamental belief that in the 21st century, national engagement has to be more than just a military response. You can't just, you cannot be as successful as we need to be without a more comprehensive whole of government, whole of society response. And it's going to be different depending on the challenges, but we should be agile enough to shape that response in such a way that it's effective, it's quick, and it enables us to achieve the goals in a quicker sense. And that is to say that the combination of the public and the private sector of the United States, we think, has to come together more effectively. I think the private sector has been a long forgotten national asset that should be used more, should be recognized, number one, and then used more diligently. Most of our competitors around the world have a very close relationship between their public and private sectors. Presidents of other countries, when they go to visit other countries, they're going with a shopping list. They're advocating for their national business, and we don't do that. We just don't do that. It's interesting, from a country that rebuilt Germany and Japan simultaneously, where the public and the private sector had to be closely interact, that over the years we've actually had a bifurcation of those responsibilities, and regrettably in some cases we've even heard elements of our government demonize the private sector as though capitalism was a bad word, profits were terrible, and so on and so forth. And that debate still goes on a little bit, but there's no question about the fact that in the world that we face today, the private sector is a valuable asset in determining the fate of this nation, its position relative to the influence in the world in the foreseeable future. And the quicker we realize that, the better off we're going to be. So this study also reflects the fact that the 3 elements of future engagement, in addition to better public and private sector partnership, have to do with security, for sure, if it's absent, economic development, and governance and rule of law. All 3 of them, though, being applied roughly at the same time and with the appropriate dosage of each, depending on what you wish to achieve. And as we look at the Afghan and Iraqi experience, we clearly overtaxed our military in terms of the expectations of them being able to do all of that. We did what we accomplished what we did very well in terms of military sense. But if there isn't anything else, and I don't just mean nationally, but I mean internationally, if you don't really work on the government in Kabul's governance and rule of law, economic development, and just capacity to govern, you're really setting yourself up for a long-term failure. Same thing in Iraq. So this century is really a century where the reactive are always too late, and the proactive might have a chance to actually do something. And you can only be proactive if you have a regional focus and you're able to move with the pace of world events. And you're willing to understand that you need a strategy, you need some regional focus and understanding, and then you need to have the agility to shape whatever response you want to bring to a particular problem, be it long-term or short-term. And just to close very quickly, this is why we picked the so-called combatant commands. Now, the reason that I don't particularly like that term is because it doesn't adequately describe everything that they do. When we created AFRICOM, which was the product of UCOM, who had the responsibility when Chuck and I were there of all of Europe and all of Africa with the exception of the Horn, I don't know, some almost 90 countries, we decided that it was impossible for us to do this on a kind of a singular basis, country by country. And so we decided to look at Africa the way Africans look at Africa. That's with 5 different regions. And we divided up Europe into 3 different regions. So all of a sudden, instead of 90 countries, we had 8 regions. And then we decided to interface with our ambassadors at every turn possible. And we found that the world was much easier to understand if you had this regional approach and regional presence. And so that was really kind of the genesis of this kind of study. And we actually experimented a little bit in bringing other members of our interagency into the European Command headquarters at high level, at pretty high level, and even private sector. Companies, big companies who want to do business in Africa, we invited to come by UCOM to get a briefing from people who spend their whole workday thinking about a particular country in Africa. So this is really what this study is about, and it is about celebrating the fact that combatant commands, and I would prefer to call them unified commands, the reason that, a large part of the reason why AFRICOM is in Germany and not in Africa is because despite proposals to the then Defense Department to not call this a combatant command, we insisted on doing it. And as a result, every country in Africa said, well, not in my backyard. We don't want to start a war here. You're going to put a warfighting capability. I'm suggesting that the warfighting capability is necessary, but that we can do a hell of a lot more to enhance who we are as a nation and to project the total whole of government, whole of society in a much more effective way by thinking about ways in which we can transform this wonderful gift that was bequeathed to us in the 20th century and making it more representative of our government as a whole. So thank you very much for that. And George, I look forward to participating in our discussion. Barry, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. No, we put you in the middle.
Yeah, you want me in the middle?
Yeah, let's do
sure.
that. Yeah.
I do whatever the 6'4" general says. Well, thank you so much, General Jones, for imparting the key insights from the effort that you led. I also wanted to introduce Ambassador George Moose, a very brief introduction because you have his biography. I've been really thrilled to work with both him and General Jones. But George Moose is Vice Chairman of the U.S. Institute of Peace. He's a board director here at the Atlantic Council. He's a former Assistant Secretary of State for Africa and had numerous postings across Africa, and has done a lot of work for the State Department on almost every continent from what I can see. And we were really honored to have George's substantive contributions to this broader effort. I might ask General Jones a question, just a clarifying question or two, and then I would really love to hear, George, your broader assessment of this. General Jones, the first question I had for you, so now I'm going to turn like this because I'm in the middle, is sort of what's your sense of the key problem statement for this effort? Why do we need to do this now? What's wrong with the status quo? As you said, these are very valuable military instruments, and we have a very robust diplomatic corps as well.
You mean because things are going so well? Well, I do think that I do think that nations, like businesses, have to really understand the environment that they're in if they're going to compete. It's absolutely true that empires have fallen because they have not been able to react to changing environments. And empires fall for two reasons. One is they're either conquered from external forces, or two, they collapse from within because the environment has changed and they can't adjust to it. And with regard to the American century, which was the 20th century, it's not a gift from heaven that the United States is destined to be as influential on the planet in 2050 as it was in 1950. I'm not predicting American decline, but a lot of people are, and I think it's useful to think about the institutions that served us so well in one century, and to really take a very hard look at those same institutions and organizations and saying, is this really the best structure that we need to put forward to achieve our national goals? Because this century is, in my view, completely different. So there's some strategic thinking requirements involved, but it is for the long haul. It is for to help the United States be the nation that we all want it to be. I think our children and grandchildren expect it to be, but it isn't going to happen, just naturally. And you have to think about, reorganization, restructuring, and different ways of approaching things that are maybe somewhat counterintuitive as opposed to the way we did business in the 20th century.
Yeah, it seems to me that when you think of some of the major reorganizations over the last 10 or 15 or even 20 years, we reorganize after disasters. Mm-hmm. So 9/11 hits, we have a commission, we developed the Director of National Intelligence and the Department of Homeland Security. It seems like you're suggesting we be proactive and try to get ahead of the challenges, the types of challenges that we're facing.
On this case, and I think, at least for me, what the imperative here is to understand that regional presence, in a broader sense, other than just military, is probably something that we ought to really think about and think about how we do that.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Moose, I want to turn to you. We certainly have heard from a very prominent military and national security expert, General Jones. I'd really love to leverage your very impressive background at the highest levels of the Foreign Service. We've had discussions about this before. Sort of, what's your overall sense of this? Are there any lessons from the Benghazi review in particular that I think are attached to this set of recommendations? And then the second part of the question, and it's a bigger one, would be sort of what are the key challenges we would face in getting the Department of State to be able to move forward in this fashion?
Well, first and foremost, thanks very much for this opportunity and the invitation from General Jones to participate in the task force to begin with. And I think, and I want to thank Kim Campbell as well, which was terrific as our guiding us through this exercise. But I guess let me start by saying that I learned a great deal from this enterprise. One of the things I learned is that our military is much more out of the box in its thinking than the State Department is. Maybe that doesn't come as a surprise to many other people. But also much more strategic in the vision, not just of military capacities, but of the full range of our national security and diplomatic and development strategies. And so one of the things I learned from this was an appreciation for that perspective that General Jones, but also other of the military participants in this exercise brought to the table. And so that's one thing. The second thing I will say is, and I spent 2 tours in Africa where that relationship at the time with EUCOM was very important for us in terms of the relationships we were trying to build with local military establishments, and particularly trying to help them understand what it's like to be a responsible military in a democratic society. Mm-hmm. And that relationship was extraordinarily important to us in helping to set that example and demonstrate that. And so I came to value that. And then I spent 4.5 years as head of the Bureau of African Affairs during a time of enormous crisis on the continent. Rwanda, Sierra Leone, Liberia, go down the checklist. And some successes as well, South Africa. And what that brought home to us is the fact that if you think you're going to deal with the challenges of Africa without a strong national security element in your policy, you're smoking something. You don't understand the challenges that you face. That was, I left that office in 1998. If anything, in the last decade and a half, those challenges of conflict and violence are even greater today than they were before. And that's a reality for us, and it's a reality we can't walk away from. So, if anything, one has to, if you're thinking about American policy, American interests, you have to start by acknowledging that we are going to need this capacity, this extraordinary, unique capacity, because we're the only ones who have one, right? We're the only ones who have this structure, this deployed structure of a military presence around the world. And if anything, that presence is even more important to us now than it was 15 years ago when I was Assistant Secretary. I just come from a conference over at USIP where we're talking about exactly this. What's the major challenge in the run-up to the Africa Summit that's coming up in 2 weeks' time? What should that agenda be? Well, clearly for me, at the center of that agenda, there's got to be the conflict agenda. Because if you look at the continent, there is more violence there now than there was before. And that violence, whether it's insurgencies, rebellions, terrorism, narcotics trafficking and other criminality, you name it, is threatening all of the other agendas that we're trying to accomplish. So if anything, we're going to be more closely knit with our colleagues at the Pentagon than we ever were before. And in fact, if you look at the continent, we have a greater military presence on the African continent today than we had 10 years ago. It's not big, it's not one place, it's not a battalion here or there, and this dispersed deployment across the continent to deal with banditry in Somalia, Boko Haram's influence in Nigeria, Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, all of these things, our military is more present today than they were before. Okay. I am someone who's over the years learned the importance of institutional capacities and how difficult it is to build them, and how short-sighted you are if you dismantle them before you know what you're doing. And so I look at the regional unified command structure, leaving aside the words combatant command, and I say, this is an enormous resource. And the challenge for us is going to be to figure out how we better make use of it. So in the course of our conversation, as you recall, we started out talking about combatant commands, and we said, well, what can we do to fix the combatant commands so that make them more relevant to the challenges that are going on today? But very quickly, we discovered that one of the problems for the combatant commands is that they don't have a robust counterpart or a framework within which to organize their activities, right? And why is that? Well, it's because I would argue that the other instrumentalities, the civilian instrumentalities, starting with the State Department, have over the years, for a whole variety of reasons, been disempowered and devalued. And that the State Department, and particularly the regional assistant secretaries, are not encouraged to play the role that I think traditionally was envisaged for them. That is to say, the role of trying to be the integrators, not just of State Department policy, but of US national foreign policy and security policies. It's not encouraged. It's not expected. It's not in the job description. And nobody gets pinged for not doing that. But somebody's got to do that. And what we quickly realized in the course of our conversation was that if the regional commanders were going to be successful, they needed a framework, a policy framework, and a programmatic framework within which they could conduct their activities. And so that led us, as you recall, to say, okay, then what do we need to do to fix the State Department so that it can provide that? When AFRICOM was being stood up, I think some of the reasons that General Jones cited, the fact that it was called the Combatant Command and there was this sort of surge of push and desire to put it out there in the field, generated resistance not only in Africa but also in the State Department. But in so doing, I think my colleagues at State missed an opportunity, because the opportunity was, in fact, to create a mechanism which would have allowed for the greater integration of our defense security policy on the one hand and our foreign policy and our development policy on the other. Real opportunity. Because number one, we were creating a command that was unified and was focused on Africa. And number two, it was one that was open to this kind of involvement and engagement. And you know, again, I can understand why the hesitation and the resistance, but I think it was an opportunity missed. And perhaps we can recoup it in some way. Because I still think that at the end of the day, what we need are better mechanisms for connecting all of the elements of national power, as General Jones just described. And until and unless we do that, we are going to be shortchanging ourselves in our ability to deal with the real challenges on the continent. So that's where I am, and I do think that a lot of the focus for, if you're going to fix the system, I mean, there are issues within the military, and I will defer to those who know better about that structure, but I would also say there are, if this is to succeed, it's going to require an effort and a focus on the other elements, and I would start with the State Department because, in fact, traditionally, that was the role that was envisaged for the State Department, to be that coordinator, to be set the framework within which all of the elements of our government, and indeed of the non-governmental sector, can also operate to achieve and advance U.S. national security objectives.
Thanks very much. I'll ask a couple more questions, and then we'll open it up a little bit more. Mr. Ambassador, I also wanted to just link this to just a comment you made during the course of the project, where you linked it to the review of the Benghazi attack, and I would really love to hear sort of you connect those dots for us.
Okay. See if I can remember how we connected those dots, because it was. But I think the dots do connect in this way. You know, the foundation of authority and responsibility and accountability within the State Department is the structure of the ambassador, right? The ambassadorial letter that she receives from the president saying, these are your responsibilities, et cetera, et cetera. That paradigm is being challenged in a whole variety of different ways. It's being challenged in the fact that the environment in which we are operating is increasingly complex. And it is not simply national. And this goes back to really the core of the report. It is, you know, you cannot define the problem within national borders. You certainly can't define terrorism that way. You can't define criminality that way. Environmental challenges you can't define that way. So within that framework, then one has to ask the question, what then is the role, the responsibility of the ambassador? And what is the mechanism above that that ensures that there's going to be meaningful integration, not only across the various elements, but geographically across? And I think, so that the question of the role of the ambassador in the Benghazi situation, it was a question of, that personality who has traditionally been given so much authority, but the fact of the matter is the consequences of errors, mistakes, are greater than what happens within one country. And somebody else has to acknowledge and accept some responsibility for that. In the case of the post-Benghazi review, one of the things we said to the Secretary of State and others was that, assistant secretaries cannot simply decline responsibility for these kinds of issues. I think the same thing is true with regard to security issues. You can't simply say, well, we've got this wonderful Department of Defense over here, and we'll just leave it to them solving all those interesting security problems that we're not equipped to deal with. The fact of the matter is that those problems can only be solved within a larger framework that says, how do we, if you're dealing with the problem of terrorism, you're not going to, General Jones knows this better than I, you're not going to win against terrorism if all you deploy is your military assets. Okay. So I think the State Department is going through a whole variety of different challenges as well that it's going to have to come to grips with. It's going to have to accept that it has more accountability for not just the narrow range of diplomatic initiatives and endeavors, but it has to assume some greater vision for what is our overarching objective, and how then do we bring together the elements of our government and beyond in order to achieve those objectives. I will just say on the other side, though, that means that certain elements of our government, I will say that US Congress and the National Security Council are going to have to empower the department to do those kinds of things.
I see. Let me ask that very question of General Jones. This looks like it would change. It would require not just a significant change in State Department sort of culture, training, personnel practices, et cetera, but importantly for this endeavor, it might require a lot more resources.
Right.
And what's your sense of sort of, I think the easiest, least resistance approach from those that receive your recommendations will be, well, we can't afford this now. It's, haven't you seen the budgets going down, and in particular the budgets for the State Department are not skyrocketing. What's your sense of sort of how to deal with the fiscal criticism of these suggestions?
Well, I mean, I could go back to Secretary Gates's pronouncements that, there is budgetary imbalance. I mean, the defense budget of the United States is an order of magnitude bigger than by factor of 4 or 5 than anyone else's, and that is something that you have to look at. In my view, this reorganization, if you will, would involve a resource rebalancing a little bit, but would also task the Defense Department to really focus its military on the most likely missions that we're going to face, which emphasize specialized forces, forces that can train other armies, and smaller, more diverse, and more deployable and sustainable forces, with an overall look at the organization that if you really do need to ramp up, you do have that capacity from your national asset. And that's why we have, some people are talking about, well, maybe it was a mistake to walk away from conscription, So I think that there's a bigger debate to be had there, but I do think that number one, it won't be as expensive as people might think, because you're using more assets in a more regionally deployable basis, and you need to rebalance the assets that you currently have. And I think the Defense Department understands full well that at the current rate of expenditures, particularly on manpower, that the defense budget is not sustainable. I mean, we've gone from when I was a service chief up until 2003, we were spending 50% or less of our budget on manpower costs. My successor, twice removed, or actually 3 times removed now, is spending 70% of his budget on the same manpower costs. And so if you don't do something, in another decade, you're going to be 80 or 90%. To me, you cross into the danger zone when you're spending 50% of more than 50% of your budget on manpower costs. And by that, I'm talking about military health care, retirement, and the whole thing.
Yeah, I have to say, during the task force, as it did its work, some of us interviewed some former combatant commanders and former service chiefs. And even though I spent a decade and a half in the Pentagon, I was really taken by some of the former commanders offering to us the resource savings that could be gained from reducing the headquarters in these commands. I was very surprised, and I know there's ongoing studies by the GAO and others. They said, the staffs have grown way too much in some of these military commands. There's a lot of redundancy, significant savings from moving back office functions back to the Pentagon, et cetera. But these commanders also said, and some of the stories were really interesting, they would take trips and they had no counterparts from the State Department to go with them. And we had former commanders meeting with sheiks, heads of state, and they expressed significant discomfort doing business that was really the business of diplomacy to help integrate all the civilian elements. I don't know if you, do you have any thoughts from your career where you wish there was such an individual that had this kind of power, sort of a forward regional ambassador at large?
Let me back up and say this and go back to the original question, which is this: how do we solve the problem of enhancing the capacities and the capabilities of the State Department and, by extension, others, so that they can play their appropriate role, and that therefore they create that framework within which all of us can be more effective. And I do think it really is an issue of, if you will, of rebalancing, and that was Secretary Gates's terminology, and our former chairman here, Secretary Hagel, has used the same terminology. And I don't, at the end of the day, yes, there's a resource component to that. But I'm not sure that the resource component is the biggest constraint in our ability to do that. Clearly, the State Department would benefit from having better resources that would enable it to move around more freely and engage more, but more importantly, to build those platforms, those embassy platforms, on which everything else depends. I mean, if those things aren't there, you can't do anything else. And that's one of the major challenges that the State Department faces at the moment, is having adequate platforms which will support the full range of activities that we would like to put on them. And I think it's a particular problem in Africa precisely because those tend to be the least well-resourced of all of our capacity at a time when the challenges are even greater. So I think the greater challenges are cultural. I think it's going to require a change of culture in the State Department, a recognition that, yes, indeed, we are charged with doing this, and we can do it. But I also think it's going to require some changes elsewhere in our government. And with due respect to the office that General Jones led at the National Security Council, I mean, I think if you look at what's happened over the last 2 decades, the National Security Council has inexorably assumed more and more and more responsibility and a reluctance to delegate that responsibility further down. And I think that's been a major challenge and a constraint for the NSC, because at the end of the day, it's a small staff. It can't manage everything. Right. But it's also imposed constraints on everybody else because they don't feel empowered to do it either. So there has to be some redefinition of roles, responsibilities here, and a willingness to delegate to, lowly assistant secretaries who are, appointed and confirmed by the Senate, that responsibility, and to hold them accountable for playing that role. And if we do those two, and I think it would be aided, frankly, if there were some acknowledgement, I don't know whatever form, from the Congress to say, yes, we understand the importance of this role, and we expect the State Department and its regional assistant secretaries to play that role. And if you get those things in alignment, I think that you create the basis for which we can have a much more synergistic and integrated strategy for so many of our problems.
I'll just add I think the ambassador is exactly right. And I think one of the things that has complicated our ability to operate in this manner is frankly the shortcuts that technology allows you to take. In the not too distant past, an ambassador might hear from Washington once a week simply because that's what technology would allow. And conversely, other countries, if they wanted to know anything about the United States, had no choice but to go to the embassy and ask the ambassador because the communications just simply weren't there. I mean, I remember the communications link in a transatlantic sense in the 1940s and 50s. You'd pay a lot of money to make a transatlantic call. So a lot of it went by mail and by air, but there wasn't that immediate gratification you get by calling. I'll call my friend in Washington. They'll know, and we don't have to go through the embassy. So if you get a guy, if you know a Barry Pavel in the National Security Council, and you're the undersecretary for whatever in some foreign country, and you can go to your president and say, "Oh, I talked to Barry Pavel at the National Security Council, and by the way, he is in the White House." That trumps, well, we talked to the ambassador and he's checking.
Let me give you one illustration. I happened to be off in Pakistan. It was 2 years ago doing a sort of an inspection thing for the Office of the Inspector General. And we were there for 15 days. And we counted up in the course of that 15 days how many civets, classified video conferences there were between Washington and the embassy, and not just Washington, but the National Security Council. There were 40. If you've got
how many days?
In 15 days. So if you've got that kind
Sorry,
of...
what's wrong with that?
I rest my case. But if you've got that kind of intimate involvement, but it is inevitably disempowering to ambassadors.
Yeah, it is.
It's disempowering to the State Department. And let's be clear, there are circumstances, and Pakistan may well be one, because I happen to agree that it's probably the most dangerous place in the world right now. That may be one where indeed that kind of engagement is absolutely justified. But you can't run the world that way. And so you've got to figure out, okay, how else, what are the other mechanisms that you need in order to make this work for us?
I think that the responsibility of the central government is to, above all, write good strategic policy, and trust your field to implement the policy. But unfortunately, it is, and we used to have meetings in the NSC where I would preach that, and Barry will, I said, our job is not to do everybody else's job. Our job is to coordinate the activities so that every member of the interagency who has equities on a particular issue feels like they've been consulted. And that was the president's guidance. He said, I want to hear all viewpoints. But it's very, very tempting to, once you get that presidential decision, to micromanage it from your desk, because you can. You can. I mean, you can. The power of the telephone, the power of the immediate fax and transmission, the power of the VTC it could be a double-edged sword, and it takes strong leadership to delegate, and you have to. But it's the most effective kind of leadership. The more senior you are, I think, the more of a consensus builder you are. Everybody can make decisions, but building consensus, empowering subordinates, making them feel that their ideas are important, and then delegate the execution. This is why I think you can push the regional engagement as far away from Washington as possible, whether it's military, whether it's State Department, whether it's commerce, is a good thing to do, as long as you have good people out there that are doing it.
And I would agree with that. I mean, I think, again, go back where I started on the AFRICOM example, which is acknowledging all of the problematics that went with the rollout of AFRICOM, and there were many, and communications with our own government, let alone with other governments, about what this was and why we were doing it and what it represented and what was it a threat to local African governments. the reality was the embrace of this notion that it was not going to be just military, that it was going to be multidimensional and diverse in terms of the capabilities that we wanted to integrate and to figure out how that coordination could take place. It was an opportunity. It was an opportunity to create a different platform that extended the authorities and the coordinating abilities of our offices and our agencies back here in Washington. And again, I think I regret that that wasn't more fully explored, and perhaps there will be an opportunity to do that now. But I do think it represented a capacity that we shouldn't dismiss in terms of our ability to do the things that we wanted to be able to do in the field. And so I hope that some of the ideas that came out of this report, some of them are a little radical, but I think intentionally so because they are provocative. I think they do challenge us to think differently about how we conduct our business in the field. And the fact that we do need to be more regional than we currently are. I mean, that's the reality. The reality is we do not spend enough time, not even in the State Department and the regional bureaus, thinking about the regional dimensions of what we do. I mean, our structures in most regional bureaus are, we have sub-regional offices, we have desk officers, and then we have the couple of overarching sort of regional kinds of superstructures. But I can tell you that those structures do not think sub-regionally or regionally to the extent that they should in terms of the nature of the challenges as we face.
Yeah, the other thing too is, and this is a blinding flash of the obvious, but it is very advantageous if you're working in the same time zone as the countries that you're trying to affect, and we're not doing that. You know, we basically, depending on what time zones you're dealing in, you might have a 3-hour window in a day where you can actually talk to somebody. And so this is another advantage of, you know, someone thinking that, you know, I wonder what the position of the U.S. government is, and oh, I'll call Ambassador so-and-so at AFRICOM, because he's in the same time zone. Same thing in the Pacific, you know, same thing in the... Yeah.
We had the added advantage. You had Mary Yates, who was out in AFRICOM, and so she was there, and so she was co-located with all of this facility, including airplanes, dare I say, abilities to move around. And so here were these assets that were at her immediate command, and were also, by extension, at the command of the State Department. And therefore, they were there to be used to advance our broader interests. And I just think that there were opportunities there to make more effective use of that platform in the way we did our business in the field.
That's great. It's a great conversation. You really stressed my moderating skills there. Why don't we open it up to questions from the audience? And I do think that the last part of this conversation greatly clarified what we're talking about here. We're not talking about policy development. I mean, the interagency process here in Washington. We're talking about synchronizing and integrating the execution of the different arms of the U.S. government and rebalancing those to have more of a diplomatic face and not solely military. So
can I suggest that we call on General Wald first?
Yeah.
I was actually thinking that, but I didn't want to put him on the spot.
Yeah. Because you had a lot to do with this, Chuck. So.
No, but I have a question from that standpoint. Thank you. Anyway, Tom always gives me all his credit, just in case it's wrong. Yes, I mean, but no, I appreciate it a lot. And he practiced what he preached. He was a great delegator, a great leader. The question is for you, Ambassador. A couple things. One is a comment, and that is kind of what the COM talked about there a little bit. When there's a crisis, people will go to the people they know. Yeah. And they'd go to the General Generals at times. And Turkey was a great example of that, where and there was a big conflict about to who they were talking to, and there was no choice but for General Jones to talk to the Turks before the invasion of Iraq. The question I'd have for you is, and I'm a big fan of this concept, is if in fact this were to occur, one comment would be, how about not an assistant secretary of state, but a regional secretary of state? Forget the assistant. Number two is, how do you think that relationship would work with your counterpart back here in Washington if that were to occur? So my feeling is, I think the ambassador in this case, or the State Department person, should be the preeminent regional person. And how would that work?
Well, I have to say, for me, that's a bridge too far. But you know, it's interesting because it then poses the challenge. And the challenge is, how do assistant secretaries currently, I like the term regional, by the way. That's, I would take that as an elevation. But how do assistant secretaries back in Washington engage with their counterparts, and they have many, it's not just the governments, but others as well, out in the field? Well, I can tell you that when I was assistant secretary, I spent 40% of my time on the road in Africa. And I don't see any other way of doing that, and I guarantee you that Linda Thomas Greenfield right now is doing the same. So you do that. But you know, the fact of the matter is, there's no way in the world that one person is going to be able to conduct 50 different conversations, or 54 with the 54 different leaders in Africa. And so you need to figure out, okay, if it's not me, yeah, maybe it is the UCOM commander. The important ingredient in that is that we be together, and whatever that message is, and understanding what we're trying to accomplish out of that conversation. So again, I'm very open to using different assets in a variety of different ways to accomplish the mission. And I think that's what we ought to be focusing on, recognizing that at the end of the day, our assets are limited. You know, there's no way that we can effectively deal with every opportunity or challenge that we face. And therefore, the question for us is, how do we make the most effective use of the talents we've got?
Mm-hmm. Sure. So here comes the microphone.
So the dilemma, a little bit, the reality is, and it's probably different every time, but what I saw was the presidents of the countries would many times default to General Jones, not the ambassador. Mm-hmm. And because there's this implied authority and power, you know, the four-star regional commanders are a big deal in the world. No,
they're a big deal.
But they were important, right?
Yeah, indeed.
And it was always embarrassing to me that you could go to a country and get a visit with the president that the ambassador might not have been able to get. Yeah. I think that's wrong. Yeah. I think that should be you being that person, for example. Yeah.
And I think, again, I would be concerned if the regional commander took that meeting. Without at least saying, okay, what effect is this going to have on that ongoing relationship that we're trying to develop? Yeah. So, look, there are problematics in this. The reality is, let's face it, the military comes with assets the State Department does not have and will never have. So the question is, how do what are the equalizers here? How do you balance that? How do you make the most effective use of them? And I think there are ways to do that, you know, without giving the State Department regional directors their own air forces and navies and all the rest of it. Yeah.
We have a question here in the middle.
Thank you. Thank you, General Jules, and thank you, Mr. Ambassador. My name is Rafi Katab, and I work with a group called Capitalize International. My question has to do with not tactics, like appointing an ambassador, regional ambassador would be a tactic, rather looking at the strategy, creating a strategy that would drive that tactic. For example, one of the challenges now is in global engagement, the United States has these wide-ranging sort of general strategies rather than region-specific or country-specific strategies that would actually drive these tactics of appointing ambassadors. Has there been any thought given to that? Also, another challenge would be, moving beyond 21st century strategy making, would be to move beyond looking at the world's events from an instrumental order perspective into a normative contractual order perspective. How do we do that? And once you do that, then you can get into the specifics of where, under a region-specific strategy, which attribute of national power is most effective. Whether it could be soft power, education, civil society, whatever, in the MENA region, or hard power in Ukraine or South China Sea region. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So strategy was part one.
Strategies Part 1. And I do think look, we have a system of planning which, both on the defense side as well as on the civilian side, which attempts to define what our challenges are and to devise and develop strategies for responding. And that's not just a global one, it's a regional strategy. And when I was Assistant Secretary, I'm sure something comparable exists today. There's an annual exercise in which we go through and identify, what are the threats, what are the challenges, what are the opportunities, and what are our strengths in approaching those? And how do we then try to define the respective roles, contributions of the elements of our government in order to achieve that? I think that can be much better done. I think that there are going to be much better, closer synergies between state defense and others in developing those strategies. And I think something along the lines of what we're talking about here maybe creates a framework for being able to do that. As a general proposition, I'm very clear about what I think we need to be doing in that part of the world that I know best, which is Africa. And it's one of the key roles of our regional commands, and that is, how do we build the capacity of local institutions, be they governmental institutions or non-governmental institutions, so that those societies are better able to manage their own affairs. That's what we want to do. We want to try to build institutions, democratic institutions that are going to be sustainable, that are going to enable those societies to succeed. We want to build economic institutions that are going to create development. We want to build resiliency against conflict and violence so that societies don't fall into violence. And that's what we spend a lot of our time doing. And I would argue that we'll get much better bang for our buck if we are better coordinated in looking at across the spectrum of institutions, military, civilian, and otherwise, to achieve that objective. So that, for me, is sort of, if you will, it's not an academic principle, it's just a fundamental reality that what we want to do is better enable our friends to manage their own affairs. If we can achieve that by a better integration of our own authorities, we will be well ahead of the game. Yeah.
Thanks. I think we had a question here, and I missed it the first time.
So I'm Michael Tint, and about a year ago I published an article in the Small Wars Journal called Getting Diplomats to Lie Down with Devil Dogs, where I call for co-locating the regional secretaries with the combatant commands, integration of the line of Goldwater-Nichols, delineation of responsibilities between the NSC and the regional ambassadors. So it's very gratifying to see that I'm not completely crazy. The question I have to ask is, the State Department is famously unreformable.
You said that, I didn't.
I take full responsibility. Do you think the state, and since I published that article, the people who I've talked to about it have the most criticism has always come from the State Department. The Defense Department generally is like, yes, we like this idea. Now, I'm not to pick a fight, but do you think the State Department is really ready to accept what is, at the end of the day, going to be a profound change in the relationship, in its internal structures, the relationship between the ambassadors and the regional bureaus, and even what to do with the functional bureaus in the State Department? Do you think State Department is ready for that sort of profound change? And if not, how do we get it to be ready?
I think that there are some people who are as concerned as I am about the current misalignment between the department's at least putative responsibilities and its capacities, and are concerned to try to figure out how we fix that. But I won't dispute your contention. It is the oldest department. It is a department that is very steeped in its ways, and it's a department that's very hard to change. But I would add to that, what's happened, unfortunately, and I want to get political here, but what's happened is that the department has been largely denigrated. I remember getting called to a hearing on the Hill in which basically I was asked why the State Department was undermining the foreign policy of the President of the United States. And there is that sort of perception that somehow we're not part of the game, whereas our colleagues in the military are deemed to be both loyal and effective and competent, and so given the options, we'll send the money to the Pentagon and not to the State Department. That's got to change. you can do all the other things you want to do, but unless there's a sense of appreciation and recognition that we need a functioning and competent diplomatic establishment in order to carry out and advance the interests of the United States of America. And that seems to me ought to be something on which we can all agree, I would hope. But it's got to start there. It's got to start there with a recognition that the department has an important role, that it needs to be empowered to do that role, and needs to be resourced to do that role, and supported in that. And if you have that, I think the cultural changes inside will follow. People are eager to do what they were hired to do, just want to be given an opportunity to do it.
Some years ago, I proposed to the then Secretary of Defense, Cohen, that we put a very senior military office right outside the Secretary of State's office. And conversely, you put a very, very senior State Department office right outside the Secretary of Defense's office. That was roundly shot down by the vested interest in both, the State Department and the Defense Department, who saw that as a way to bypass their very, very important functions. But the truth is, this is a very small town, but the distances between heads of agencies is very large. And one function that the NSC does make people do is make people come together and talk to each other. And I think at the national level and at the regional level and at the tactical level, the operational level, I think we need to look for ways in which we stay together on these big strategic issues. And there's ways to do that, but I don't think we've got it completely wired.
Thanks very much.
For example, if I could, as an example, I think the importance of the Department of Commerce is arguably should be one of the most rapidly growing influences in our town. I think Secretary Pritzker is off to a great start. She has adopted this commercial diplomacy, which should reinforce foreign policy, which should reinforce security policy, and we need to work together to make sure that all of those pieces come together. And so there is movement out there, but it really needs, it has to come from the top, and it has to be, kind of a sea change in terms of how we approach the strategic vision for who we are in the world and what we want to be, and secondly, how we get there.
I think we have time for one or two more questions. Yes.
Hi, Breon Wells. I have a question for both of you, actually. Ambassador Moose, I know you spoke about the State Department being continuously denigrated. And in reading this report, I was wondering if there was a reason why there was not a more overt call for an increase in financial allotments towards the State Department. In this interagency, even Secretary Gates called every now and then for more money being shifted to that. So I was just wondering why, under this interagency alignment, why we shied away from that.
Is that for both of us here?
Yes.
Okay. I think we started where we started with this, and I will defer to, we're looking organizationally. How can we better knit together the elements of our own government so that we're more effective as a unit? And I think implicitly, because we do talk about the fact that the role of the State Department needs to be enhanced. Well, part of that enhancement is in the resources. But as I said earlier, I think resources are an important part of that, but I don't think it's the most important part. I think the empowering part of this is really a recognition that there is a role and a responsibility here, and a willingness to support and encourage and empower the department to play that role is even more important than the resource part. So that's from my own perspective.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think one thing that I think we all wanted to avoid is becoming too prescriptive in how to do it. What you want is to plant the seed, and if people are interested in it, then you can develop the other things that have to happen. We'd still be meeting if we were trying to say, this is how you do it, right down to your shoelaces. But I thought the other thing I think we guard against is that people like us trying to come together to do something that's useful, you have to be respectful of the people who are in the jobs that we held. And, it wasn't that long ago when I was getting all this help from the retired community, and saying, no, thank you very much. This is exactly what I needed. Why didn't I think of this, So you have to be a little humble about what you're trying to do. We are people who care about this country deeply. We've spent our whole lives. We're trying to be helpful. We're trying to, every now and then there's a really good idea out there that comes out. Maybe this is one. We're not saying this is the most electrifying moment in the history of our foreign policy, but we do think that there's merit to thinking about how we are organized to deal with the world and how we empower people to communicate with this world in this brand still new environment of such tremendous pace and tremendously important challenges.
In the back, yeah.
Thank you. My name is Jeannie Nguyen with Voice of Vietnamese Americans. I'd like to thank the General, the Ambassador, and Mr. Pavel for your service to the country. Thank you very much. And I missed part of the conversation because I had to go out to do some broadcasting. But I would like to ask all of you with your expertise to talk a little more about the pivot to Asia, and also the point that I think the General had brought up many times with the social media, the communications. Is there a way that we can integrate all three different branches of our system, especially the Congress, share information so they can understand what you're doing better and support both the State Department and the Defense Department better, and also give out to public educations. Take example, the TPP. It seems like Congress get into the page very late, and then it has somehow put a stop into it. So you were talking about the increasing importance of the Commerce Department. I think the USDI is now having a hard time with Congress with the TPP and the TPA. That has to do with both the TTIP and the TPP as well. So in your all elements of nation powers, I wonder if there's an element of information sharing. Since we, by culture, the US is a democracy, is a democratic society, and public opinion is our key element. So many times I felt it touched my heart that our men and women in uniform have done the best they could, and we are still the best power out there. But your sacrifices were undermined just because of the poor reporters out there. The same with the fact that people are thinking the US is in decline. That's because of miscommunication out there. So there's a lot of shared information that I think we need to do. And I don't know if in your task force, if you pay attention to share information with the Congress.
Thank you. Great question.
Thank you.
So information sharing, how would this suggestion enhance or not enhance that? Was it an issue?
No, it is. I mean, it is, as we have tried belatedly, no, I take that back. We have undergone, as you well know, a major restructuring of the State Department in the last 15 years, 20 maybe, to try to better focus our capabilities on the need to communicate, and not to communicate with a whole range of different constituencies. The whole concept of public diplomacy, I think, goes well beyond our traditional understanding of what public affairs was, and a recognition that the communications element of whatever we do is a fundamental element. I mean, it's a fundamental element in wartime to be able to communicate what it is you're doing and how you're doing it, and it's equally important in peacetime. And I don't think we've got it right. I think we're still working on that. But I think the two things are not dissociated. It's hard to be coherent in your communication if your policy making is separate. So if we want to be better at communicating policy, the more we collectively communicate, work on that policy together, then I think we're going to be more effective in doing that.
I think communication and public opinion is probably the most transformative event on the planet, coupled with technological advances. And the number of countries now that can restrict information from reaching their publics are very small, very few. And they'll try to, but as far as I'm concerned, it's almost impossible to stop. And entire societies are going to transform themselves based on how the people feel and what they know about where they are on Earth as opposed to other people, and they have a basis for comparison because they can see it, they can hold it in their hands. So I think this is, if you can get on top of this one, you can do some really good things.
I think it's a great way to, unfortunately we're out of time, it's a great way to end. I mean, it's a very different world where we have such instantaneous and comprehensive awareness of what's going on, and the world is so interconnected. Before I say thank you to the two panelists, I did want to also say thank you to one of the military fellows who contributed. He's sitting in the back of the room, Colonel Revor. Thank you very much for also contributing to immensely to the task force effort. And please join me in thanking General Jones and Ambassador Moose for their.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. George, thank you. Thank you.